Hello everybody and welcome to this week's video in another edition of the Simplified opening series. This video will address one of the most popular opening choices for white, the Catalan. And I have to admit that the idea for this video came out of my own personal needs. And the reason for this is that I have faced the Catalan quite a bit in my career and I have tried a lot of lines against it, but I never had this feeling that, okay, that line is just the right one. Now, for example, in my chessable course on the lifetime repertoires based on the Queen's Gambit declined, I proposed the so-called closed system in the Catalan, and it's a perfectly valid line that I actually like a lot. I will immediately show you what I mean by the closed system. So after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight g3, d5, bishop g2, black gives the check first on b4 to force the bishop to come to d2, then the bishop drops back to e7, and after knight f3, let's say castles, black starts with knight bd7 or goes c6 and basically develops with knight bd7, b6, bishop b7 or bishop a6, and it's extremely solid position and difficult to crack. The line, like I said, is perfectly fine, but it's pretty theoretical and it requires a certain theoretical knowledge, memorization, and while obviously theoretically extremely sound, it requires also quite a bit of preparation and revision before the game. As I said, I've tried many lines against the Catalan, and I always felt that white always has this nagging edge that gives him either a safe position from which to push a little bit, or an annoying initiative in those lines where black is grabbing the pawn on c4, defending it, and gives white the initiative. So as I'm following modern theory, quite recently I noticed a very interesting line, an idea that I saw in the games of Magnus Carlsen, none other than Carlsen, where he in fact tried to counter the Catalan in a more dynamic style. And this immediately caught my attention because, as you may know, one of my favorite opening strategies is to try to take my opponent into territory which is not to his liking. For example, if my opponent chooses an opening where he wants to be safe and press from a safe position, I would like to change the scenario, change the dynamic of that tendency and drag him into a type of position where he cannot do that. And in the Catalan this is difficult to do so, obviously, but I think that this Carlsen's idea that I'm going to demonstrate in this video is quite promising in that respect. So without further ado, let me show you what I have in mind. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Of course, you can enter the Catalan if you play the Queen's Gambit declined as well. So d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3, and there we are. Okay. So let's say, okay, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, and now bishop e7. Like I mentioned, the closed system that I analyzed in great depth, and I found some very nice ideas for black in my chessable course on the Queen's Gambit declined, is still perfectly sound, perfectly solid, and it leads to a different type of position where black is banking on this solidity of his center and the position. But this time we look at something different. So bishop e7, knight f3, castles. Castles usually is white's choice. The move queen c2 is possible, but we will react in the same way as after white's castle. This is the starting position of the so-called main line of the Catalan, and black's most popular move in this position is the so-called open system as opposed to the closed system, which starts with c6 that I mentioned earlier, usually played white bishop before check first. And the open system starts with the move d takes c4. Okay, obviously open system because it opens the position a little bit. Most importantly, it opens the long diagonal for the light squared bishop on g2. And white has normally placed queen c2, attacking this pawn, and black has a wide choice here. He can go a6, intending b5, when white can either take on c4 or play a4, or the currently very popular line with b5, which was also Nepomniachtchi's prepared line against Carlsen in the World Championship match in 2021. These lines with b5, they lead to extremely deeply theoretical lines, going very deep, and for example, one of the main lines enters basically an endgame where black is a pawn down, but he has opposite colored bishops, and with precise play he should draw, but even with such deep World Championship preparation as Nepomniachtchi's, he actually managed to lose that position against Wesley So in one of the recent games. So we are not going here. And the first move in the dynamic direction here in this position is the move c5. You will soon notice that, of course, there is a price to pay when you want to play dynamic against such an opening as the Catalan, and the price we are willing to pay is an isolated queen's pawn on d5. In certain cases, we will be transposing to the Tarrasch defense, and this is well, characteristic of the Tarrasch defense that black plays with an IQP on d5, but we will insert a little twist, which I think is adds a certain, let's say, an edge in black's favor compared to the usual lines of the Tarrasch. So if you are not afraid to play with an IQP on d5 and you relish active piece play, this line can actually be for you. Another point that about this transposition to Tarrasch-like positions is that currently the Tarrasch, I think, is an underrated opening for black, and especially these lines with g3, which used to be considered and still are considered one of the main white attempts, but I think that black actually has very good play against these g3 lines. And currently the main problem for black in the Tarrasch is a different line, and that is not the lines with g3. I'll quickly jump back to the starting position to show you what I have in mind. So after d4, d5, c4, e6, let's say knight c3, c5, the Tarrasch, cd5, ed5, knight f3, knight c6. Now g3 lines would be the lines with g3, but I think black is fine here. But the main problem here nowadays is this line with d takes c5, sorry. And after d4, knight a4, bishop takes c5, knight c5, queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen takes c5, rook c1, queen b6, white plays something like e3. And what we have is we will get a symmetrical position when d4 is exchanged for e3, where white simply has the bishop pair in an open position. And this is quite not like what Tarrasch players would prefer to play, which is a kind of a prospectless, if equalish endgame, where white has the bishop pair and can press for a long time. Personally, I won a very nice game with the white pieces from this position using the power of the bishops. So this is I think the main both theoretical and psychological problems for Tarrasch players nowadays. So this line. So by playing the c5 against the Catalan, we already obviously avoid this, as white has already fianchettoed the bishop. So we're going back to the position after c5 on move 6. We arrive at the first branching point where white has a choice. Note that I mentioned instead of short castle, if white plays queen c2, c5 is again the move to play. So castle c5, and this branching point, the main moves are d takes c5 and c takes d5, both captures in the center. If queen c2, which is also possible, black has a wide choice how to play. cd4 is the main move, knight d4, and now there are moves that black can explore depending on the preferences for the middle game. One is knight c6. This has been played, for example, by Carlsen in his game against Ding Liren some years ago, a game he won. After knight c6, bc6, we have a sort of a reversed Grunfeld-like position where black has a really strong pawn structure in the center, limiting the bishop on g2. But there are also other moves like queen b6, attacking the knight on d4. There is also e5, knight f5, d4, where black gives up the bishop pair but obtains very good central control and active play. And there is also the bit strange move knight a6 with the idea of knight b4, which has been used by Wei Yi to draw against Magnus Carlsen in Waikanze some years ago. So queen c2 I will not go into more detail because I don't think it's that critical. So let's explore the more direct continuations. For a long time, it was considered that this particular transposition to the Tarrasch for black is not that great because of the move d takes c5. Either here or in the version after cd5, ed5, we will explore both. But in this particular position after dc5, bishop c5, a3, black has a choice depending on preferences, whether he likes to obtain more active play or he wants to just steer for, let's say, solid equality. Now, more active play arises after knight c6, b4, bishop b6, bishop b2, queen e7, knight bd2, and rook d8. And you can see all the pieces are on the board, and play is quite complex. Black's plan is actually to push e5 and then play in the center. The game I would recommend you take a look at after queen c2, e5 is the very nice and quite complicated game Halifman-Grishchuk played in 2003. It was won by Grishchuk, but the game was quite tense until the very end. So it's a very nice game, and nicely, I think, illustrates black's counter chances in this complex middle game position. So this is the choice you can make if you prefer more complex play. If you just want to kill the game off and steer for equality, then dc4 is your move. Now queen c2, going after the pawn on c4, and now again a choice. You can choose the more, let's say, natural move knight c6, which is, I would say, is the more human move, but you can also choose the computer's suggestion, which is knight bd7, so it defends the bishop in time. And after queen c4, another not so obvious move, a5. So it's not so much to stop b4, which it does, obviously, b4, and then there is a pin on the rook on a1, but the point is that after knight c3, b6, it allows for the move bishop a6. So this is the computer's way of activating and developing the light squared bishop, and this is again pretty good for black and equal. If you prefer the human way, knight c6, queen c4, and now either bishop e7 or bishop b6 both work. For example, bishop e7, knight c3, e5, and then the bishop is developed to e6 with the very good development. Bishop b6 also works, and knight c3, bishop d7, and then rook comes to c8. Okay, introducing ideas like knight a5, hitting the queen, and if the queen moves, the knight can come to b3. The queen will likely come to e7. It's again very solid symmetrical position, and black is doing fine. So the move dc5 without taking on d5, we can see, gives black a choice between two different ways how to treat the position. Now we move on to mainline territory, cd5, ed5, and we arrive at the starting position of the IQP positions with the pawn on d5. This is Tarrasch territory, but not quite, because of a very important difference, and that is black's knight still being on b8 and not on c6. And as surprising as it may seem, this undeveloped knight in fact gives black some extra options. And this extra option lies in fact in one of the lines that was considered very promising for white in this position, and that line starts with the move d takes c5. Now, before embarking on that, let's just quickly round up the alternatives, which are not that critical. And some of them also do transpose to the Tarrasch, but to lines that are not really critical. One of those moves is the move b3, intending, of course, to fianchetto the bishop. And here, black transposes to a very comfortable line of the Tarrasch with the move knight e4. The idea is to free the f6 square for the bishop, which will be quite an annoying piece for white, because after bishop b2 and bishop f6, that bishop on b2 is not defended, and the pawn on d4 is pinned. After knight c3, knight c6, this is a direct transposition to the Tarrasch lines. It's not played very often nowadays. It was played last year, for example, in the game Liam against Carlsen, where Lequang took on e4, which is completely harmless. The main move, in fact, is knight a4, defending the bishop on b2. But after rook e8, rook c1, b6 is the important move for black. And this is, for example, there is a classical game that you should take a look at. Larsen Kasparov, played in 1983, Those were the good old days where the Tarrasch was Kasparov's main weapon against d4. He had a fantastic result, never losing a game in it until meeting Karpov in the 1984 World Championship match, where he lost 2 games, but they had nothing to do with the opening. So you can check this. This is perfectly fine for black. I can give you a few more moves. Let's say dc5, bishop takes b2, knight b2, and bc5. And in fact, these now hanging pawns and the very active position of the pieces, the knight on e4, bishop is coming to a6, targeting that pawn on e2, and introducing ideas like c4, give black excellent play. In fact, Kasparov won that game against Larsen from Nikšić 1983. So this is a transposition to the Tarrasch, but pretty harmless line for black. Another line that is not very critical is the move bishop e3. This has been tried, for example, by Korchnoi in his candidate's final match against Kasparov, 1983. And the typical reaction to bishop e3 is the move c4. And the only thing more or less you need to know about these structures is that when white undermines the center with b3, black should take on b3, and after queen b3 go knight c6 and simply play knight a5, hitting the queen, okay, and trying to land the knight on c4, and then try to make something of this queenside majority. White can't do the same because his central majority, that pawn on e2, cannot easily advance, and black has excellent control of the e4 square. So again, possible, but very little that black needs to know about these positions to play them successfully. So bishop e3 also not to be something to be worried about. Another move mentioning is bishop g5, but that is premature because after h6, bishop f6, bishop f6, again we see the bishop being very powerful on f6. And after knight c3, now cd4, knight d4, knight c6, we see how black uses the power of the dark squared bishop to not allow white to stabilize his central presence. So when the knight gets away from d4, from the attack square, black pushes d4. And as a pretty general rule of thumb in these IQP positions and Tarrasch positions in particular, is that if black manages to establish a well-protected pawn on d4, like in this case, for example, he generally has very good play. The reason for this is that the IQP is not really weak anymore on d4. It's not attacked by the dark light squared bishop on g2, and additionally it fixes the pawn on e2. So moves like rook e8, bishop g4 actually can put white under some pressure against that pawn on e2. So let's say knight d5, rook e8 is quite comfortable for black, who just goes bishop g4, hitting that pawn on e2, or let's say bishop f5, bishop e4. Yeah, again, exchanging the light squared bishop, and just very comfortable play thanks to the space advantage. So these are the moves that are not very critical. The critical moves are dc5, like I mentioned, and the move knight c3. So we will take a look at both. Now, I mentioned that the Catalan connoisseurs, usually in these positions, they wanted to avoid the development of the knight to c3 and preferred the move dc5, bishop c5, and now the move a3. So this was supposed to be quite good for white, because white basically wants to go for b4, expanded fianchetto, go bishop b2, okay, attack the knight on f6, then the pawn on d5 is attacked, maybe go knight c3, maybe go knight bd2, and this was supposed to be quite comfortable for white. However, this little, I would say, move and idea by Carlsen, which we still haven't seen in the main line, works in this position as well. Now, before continuing with a3, I would briefly mention that the move knight c3 transposes to the move knight c3 before taking on c5. We will take a look at it in that version. While the move bishop g5 in this position is possible, and it does transpose to the Tarrasch, but again, lines that are comfortable for black after knight c6, knight c3, and d4. The rule of thumb I mentioned works in this position as well. Well-protected pawn on d4 is a guarantee for black that he gets good play. White has some options here. Let's say knight e4, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6, which is again fine for black. For example, the exchange of white's b pawn for the for black's d pawn after b4, knight b4, knight f6, queen d4, queen e7 is obviously quite nice for black. no problems, good development, queenside majority, equality here. Or instead of, let's say, knight e4, bishop f6, bishop, queen f6, and now both knight e4 and knight d5 are possible, but in both cases black is fine. You can check some Tarrasch theory here. It's really comfortable. Basically, you put your pieces on natural squares. Rook comes to e8. Yeah, the bishop, let's say knight d5, queen d8, yeah? And then rook comes to e8, targeting e2. The bishop will come to f5 or e4 or g4. Queen d7 and bishop h3 is another idea. If attacked, the bishop from c5 can drop back to f8, even to b6 in some lines. Again, natural moves give black good play. So these are the additional option that white has in this position, bishop g5, but again, transposing to the Tarrasch is fine in this case for black, avoiding all these, let's say, more critical tries. So let's take a look what's the big idea after a3. This is supposed to be very critical for black, and this is the first time we see this idea by Carlsen that I saw in his games, and that is the move h6. So you would say, how is this such a big idea? Well, it's a very useful move, first and foremost, preventing bishop g5. And it's a very useful waiting move. So you would say, what's the waiting thing? Well, normally black was playing knight c6 in this position. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that the knight is still on b8 effectively neutralizes this critical try by white. What's the big idea? Well, and white should continue in the usual way with b4. After bishop d6, this is, I think, more natural than bishop e7, which is also possible, which was played by Abdusattorov, for example, against Wesley So. But bishop d6 is, I think, more natural. We see that the knight being on b8 gives black two advantages. The knight not being on c6, first of all, avoids an attack by b5. Why is this important? Well, because black wants to attack white's advanced queenside with a3 and b4 by playing a5, hitting that pawn on b4, and when white plays b5, it does not attack the knight on c6. And second point is that after white pushes b5, the knight very nicely from b8 is developed to d7 and b6. Oops, that's a long arrow. b6. And that's a ideal square for the knight. Let me show you. Bishop b2, a5, b5, and knight bd7. So the knight comes to b6, and it's ideal piece there. First of all, it lends extra support to the pawn on d5. And second, not less importantly, it targets this weakened c4 square, which is quite annoying for white once it lands there. It also, knight a4 can be possible at some point if the queen is removed from d1. And once on b6, the bishop will be developed from c8, whether to d7, whether to f5, whether to f6, depending on circumstances. Rook comes to c8, and another general rule for these IQP positions is that if the possessor of the IQP, in this case black, has access to the c4 square, like in this case, for a knight, this again guarantees comfortable play and no problems. So in a way you can say it's a trade. White has a good blockading square on d4, but black gets an excellent outpost on c4 in return. So you see now why this h6 move is such a great idea, because by postponing this development of the knight from b8, black gets this extra option of a5, b5, and knight bd7. So another illustrative line after bishop d6 is if white does not play bishop b2, he goes knight c3, again a5. And now if ba5, queen a5, obviously it's excellent for black. The knight is attacked, and again, without this exchange of the black's a pawn for white's b pawn, and the exposure of that pawn on a3, yeah, gives black very active play on the queen side. Also, don't forget that the c4 square is still there. So this is no problems, and this was confirmed in the game Yilmaz Kasimjanov played in 2022. So a bit more critical is b5. Now the pawn on d5 is hanging, so bishop e6, defending the pawn and intending knight bd7 as expected. So knight d4, knight bd7. And again, very good position for black. Rook is coming to c8, targeting the knight on c3, knight b6, knight c4 still on the menu. And if knight e6, f e6, a very important idea for black in this position is the move bishop e5. Again, in the previous lines, we also saw how powerful the dark squared bishop is if placed on the long diagonal, and here it's not an exception. Bishop e5, also neutralizing the white bishop after bishop b2, bishop e5. And then knight b6, knight c4 is coming, and the pawn on e6 is safely defending the pawn on d5. So black has pretty good play here. So now you see the first instance of this great idea of h6. I think really this is a very nice discovery in one of the most critical lines against the Catalan with this c5 move, which, like I said in the past, it was recommended by all Catalan authors that postponing the development of the knight to c3 and playing a3 should give white an advantage. But this h6 move, anticipating b4 with the idea of a5, I think it's a pretty good antidote. Now we turn our attention to the move knight c3. So with this move, white indicates that he's not against transposing to the Tarrasch, which would be knight c6, and we land at the tabia, one of the main tabia of the Tarrasch defense when white chooses the fianchetto line. And in this position, the most critical move for white is the move bishop g5. This has been played twice by Karpov in that match with Kasparov I mentioned earlier. Karpov won both games, but even though Kasparov was fine in the opening, this is still playable for black. And if you like, you can explore. There's a lot of theory here, a lot of good examples. But we want to steer clear of that, and we employ Carlsen's little move but great idea, again, h6. So the idea, as you see and you understand by now, is to prevent bishop g5, and also it's a very useful waiting move. And as it turns out, white cannot really take advantage of the fact that black is postponing the development of the knight from b8. There are a few tries here for white. Bishop g5 obviously is not one of them, so we can take a look at some others. One is bishop f4, knight c6, and now rook c1. Yeah, just simply developing. The bishop cannot go to g5, it went to f4, and now rook c1, just developing normally. In this position, black again has a choice what type of position he would like to play. One idea is c4. We already saw this when we were discussing the move bishop e3. And again, the only thing you need to know, after b3, cb3, queen b3, knight a5, knight c4 is the main idea. But black can also play other moves. Another one is bishop f5, dc5, bishop c5. Yeah, but again, very active piece play. Note that there is this always trick knight d5, which attacks the bishop on c5, is met by bishop f2 check. Yeah, so that's one possibility. And there is also bishop e6, which is in a way more solid, just defending the pawn on d5. And after dc5, bishop c5, knight a4, again an option. Bishop can drop back to e7, which is fine. But I would also like to show you this move, bishop b6, knight b6, queen b6, and another very acceptable position for black in the IQP, which does not look like at first sight, which when you would say, okay, black has an IQP and is lacking the good dark squared bishop. So white has the pair of bishops and the play against the IQP, but in fact black is quite doing quite all right here. And the reason for this is the activity of his pieces. So the knight can jump to e4, the queen is already targeting the pawn on b2, the rooks are coming to the center to d8, e8 or c8 depending on circumstances. d4 is also an idea. We mentioned that pushing the pawn to d4 guarantees black good play. And as it turns out, white is not able to contain all this activity by black. So even though formally black has the worst structure and lacking the pair of bishops, the activity compensates for both. And a good illustration about what this variation is all about: activity and not allowing white to employ this typical Catalan pressure, yeah, which he usually enjoys. So that's the move bishop f4, b3. again is possible. Knight c6 now, bishop b2, rook e8, and now rook c1. It's not quite possible to do the same knight e4 and bishop f6 because here playing a tempo down with h6, black doesn't quite make it, but this is perfectly fine. Yeah. And in this position, for example, we had a game Dubov Carlsen played at the World Blitz in Samarkand last year, 2023. In that game, Carlsen took cd4, knight d4, bishop g4, which is perfectly fine, but I think it leads to some unnecessary complications. I think bishop f5, a natural move, is a simpler solution. So dc5, bishop c5, again we have this development of the bishops on c5, f5, this bishop on f5 controlling the important e4 square. So let's say e3, limiting the bishop on c5 and avoiding this bishop f2 trick. And now again bishop f8 is possible, yeah, but I would like again to show you this activity that black depends on in the Tarrasch, even at the expense of worsening of the structure. So bishop b6 in this case, knight a4 and knight b4. So an important move, and one that takes advantage of the fact that white's move e3 weakens the d3 square. So knight b4, it attacks the pawn on a2, but also targets the d3 square. So after knight b6, a b6 now, opening the a file. And you could say this is even worse than the previous line when black had a queen on b6. So black has double pawns, IQP, and no bishop pair, but he's still doing great. Yeah, and again thanks to the activity of the pieces. In this case, the control of the light squares, d3, e4, and attack on the pawn on a2. Now white's best is rook a1, avoiding this knight d3 double attack on the rook on c1 and the bishop on d3, so rook a1. And now black has a choice, can start with bishop e4. Normally, again, sort of a rule of thumb in these IQP positions, if black can land the bishop on e4, neutralizing white's fianchetto with bishop on g2, black is fine, because that bishop on e4 practically eliminates any theoretical weakness of the pawn on d5, because it safely defends it and neutralizes white's bishop on g2. So that's one idea, or black can start with knight d3, landing this beautiful knight on d3, bishop d4, and now bishop e4. So these two pieces are really excellently placed. The rook is active on the a file, and white cannot easily untangle. Yeah. So again, very nice illustration of the potential, the dynamic potential of the black pieces in the IQP positions. So that's the move b3. Okay, and also brief note of the move bishop e3. We know the reaction c4, and again, the thing we need to know after b3 is to take on b3, queen b3, knight c6, and intending knight a5, hitting the queen, intending to land on c4. The bishop can come to e6 later on, knight on c4, and then perhaps start organizing, pushing b5, b4, and so forth. Good play for black. So now we turn our attention to probably the most testing move, which is to take on c5. And after bishop c5, again, a choice for white, even though some moves will transpose. For example, bishop f4, knight c6 would transpose to the move bishop f4 we looked at on the previous move. b3 again would transpose to the lines we looked at after knight c6 and rook e8, bishop f5. We looked at this just now. There is a move like a3. This was played against Carlsen. Again, you can see Carlsen played this quite a few times, this idea. This game is against Lazovic, played online this year, 2024, in which he played a5, stopping b4. Now bishop f4, knight c6, rook c1, rook e8. And now I think a typical, let's say, sequence, knight b5. It appears dangerous, hitting the bishop on c5 and threatening knight c7, attacking both rooks. Bishop b6 defends c7 and avoids the attack, and knight d6, it appears kind of what's going on here, but after rook e7, it just shows that this is literally brings white nothing. So the knight on d6 cannot do better than be exchanged for this undeveloped bishop on c8, so knight c8, and now both recaptures are possible with a rook and a queen. Carlsen took with the queen, and after knight e5 went queen e6, knight c6, bc6, and again is the activity that gives black good play. There is a pressure on the e file, e2 is hanging, there is no more IQP, this is safely defended by the pawn on c6, the pawn on c6 is defended by the queen, and black is actually quite comfortable. Knight can come to e4 if convenient, yeah, hitting f2 one more time with the bishop on b6 and the knight on e4. So good play for black. Eventually this game was drawn. So that's the move a3, again showing some play, typical play, where just by making natural moves black is doing quite all right. One more move worth mentioning is the move knight d4, and the idea is to open the fianchettoed bishop on g2 to open the diagonal for it, and the threat is to go knight b3, hit the bishop on c5 and attack the pawn on d5. And now black has a choice. He can in fact anticipate this and go bishop b6, and the idea is to continue with knight c6 and control the d4 square. And the point of the move bishop b6 is that knight b3 is not good because of d4, and we already are following the rule of thumb. Advanced pawn on d4 means good play. It is in fact a pawn sacrifice, but one that gives black excellent play after knight a4, knight c6, take on b6, a b6. The pawn is a great one, yeah, giving black good play, and taking it after bishop takes c6, bc6, queen d4, bishop d7, with the idea of c5, and the engine even thinks black is better here in spite of being a pawn down. This pawn sacrifice is reminiscent of the so-called Dubov variation in the Tarrasch defense, where black often sacrificed the d4 pawn for good compensation. In this case, the compensation is in the active pieces. Yeah, the rook is already active on the a file. There is a weakness of around white's king, the light squares around white's king. c5 would limit the knight on b3, would deny access to the d4 square. Black can develop on e7, the queen, for example, targeting the pawn on e2. Bishop can come to c6 or h3. There are also ideas like h4, h5, h4. A lot of active play for black for the pawn. So that's one idea, bishop b6, but it's also possible to sacrifice the pawn in another version. Knight c6, knight b3, bishop b6, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, and now different versions how to continue. In all of them, black is doing fine. The compensation consists of the active piece play. Just to give you some examples, bishop b6 is one idea, rook d8, rook f d8, and now black's main idea is a5, a4 to target that knight on b3. When the knight moves, knight b4 can be annoying, attacking that pawn on a2. And another problem for white is the development of this bishop on c1. It can't go to d2 because bishop b3 would win it, as it's attacked by the rook on d8. Cannot go to e3 because there is a bishop on b6. Cannot go to f4 because g5 forces the bishop back, and this little move h6 prevents the bishop from coming to g5. So white has problems with the development. That's bishop e6. Yeah, there is also bishop g4 with the idea of rook e1, queen f6. Yeah, rook e1 defends the pawn on e2, but queen f6 now attacks f2, and rook coming to d8. It's already becoming dangerous for white. In the game Tregubov-Lyoki played in 2007, white played a4, black played a5, bishop f4, bishop e2. Black regained the pawn, and the position was equal, and the game was drawn. There is also the third option after queen d5, which is to exchange queens. Queen d5, bishop d5, rook e8, attacking the pawn on e2, bishop f3, and a5. Again, the same idea, harassing that knight on b3. So knight d4, not very critical. So we go to knight a4, attacking the bishop on c5, and the bishop now drops to d6, even though the computer also likes the move b6. Yeah, and intending to play with hanging pawns, but I think bishop d6 is more natural. Bishop e3, knight c6, rook c1, and rook e8. And again, we have a standard IQP position. And there is another important idea you need to know about these structures, is that when we have a rook on e8 and a bishop on e3, the exchange sacrifice on e3, entirely positional, can sometimes work. So to illustrate, knight c5 in this position, rook e3, f e3, queen e7. A double attack on the knight on c5 and the pawn on e3. And let's say knight a4 and now knight g4. And the knight is landing on e3, and black is already somewhat better here. So always keep in mind this idea of rook takes e3 when there is a bishop on e3 and the rook on e8. So in the game Giri Aronian, played in Leuven 2017, Giri avoided it by playing bishop c5. But after bishop c5, knight c5, black is perfectly fine either by playing queen a5 or, as in the game, Aronian played queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2, knight a4 and queen a6, now targeting the pawn on e2. And he continued with bishop g4, rook a d8, absolutely no problems whatsoever. Thanks again to the activity. And the final move to check after rook e8 is the move knight d4. Now the sacrifice on e3, while possible, I don't think it gives black sufficient compensation. But there is a pawn sacrifice that gives black good compensation, and that is bishop e5. So sacrificing the pawn after knight c6, bc6, rook c6, but now bishop f5. And again, beautiful bishops, control over the e4 square, rook b8 can come, yeah, activating the rook. Again, white cannot consolidate the position to contain black's activity. This is good compensation for black. But also the simple bishop d7 is sufficient, yeah, defending the knight on c6. And let's say something like knight c5, bishop c5, rook c5, queen b6, attacking the rook and attacking the pawn on b2, queen c1 and queen a6 again. We saw this maneuver from the game Giri Aronian. The queen is quite active on a6, targeting the pawn on e2 and the pawn on a2. And again, IQP, bishop pair for white, but black is perfectly fine thanks to the activity of the pieces. So this wraps up the analysis of this, I think, dynamic way of meeting the Catalan, thanks to this little move but great idea by Carlsen, move h6, which I think steers the game away from the usual ways that white would like his Catalan game to develop. So this wraps it up. Like I said, I hope you like this presentation, this analysis. Thanks for watching. Yeah, leave your comments in the comment section. Tell me what you think, and also don't forget to note my Cowboy Hikaru moment, which is smash that subscribe button and make me happy with more subscribers to the channel. Also, check out my Substack weekly newsletter with some bits and pieces of chess wisdom every week delivered to your inbox. Also, note that the Substack also has a link to the weekly videos, so you don't miss them when they come out. I hope to be able to announce something important soon enough. I mentioned this in the last video as well. Maybe I will do it before this video is released. I'll think about it when to exactly do it, but I think it's quite exciting news. Okay, I won't spoil it too much for now. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and like I said, subscribe, comment, tell me what you think on Twitter, anywhere really. See you soon. Take care.